You're talking about, you went back to Russian capabilities. Can you tell me more about the Oreshnik missile? It's got the advanced maneuvering capabilities, which makes it very difficult for NATO to intercept. How concerning is that warhead?
Well, I think it's a very powerful weapon that could have a devastating impact in any war. The Oreshnik deploys multiple warheads accurately against a large set of targets. It's hypersonic. It moves at a speed that we cannot capture and then ultimately target effectively. And as you point out, all of this can be guided. I mean, one of the challenges for us, we've been working on hypersonic missiles as well, is maneuvering a hypersonic missile in flight. It's extremely difficult. They seem to have broken the code on this. So, I mean, you say concerning. I'd be very damn worried right now. I wouldn't want to go to war given the disparity in capability in rocketry and missile technology between ourselves, the Russians, and the Chinese.
Yeah, I remember the day that they deployed it in Dnipro. It was a pretty uneasy day for anyone that was watching. You also referenced what's happening between Israel and Iran, and I've been covering this extensively since the Qatar strike. First, we haven't spoken since the Qatar strike. What was your initial reaction? That was for me, that day was more shocking than when the Iran war broke out, because that's a U.S. ally. I know it's not a new war being struck, but everyone expected Israel and Iran to eventually, potentially get into a war. But no one really expected, at least not me, expected Qatar to be struck, a U.S. ally with the biggest U.S. foreign base, to be struck by Israel.
Well, when this happened, I was a little surprised initially, and I asked the question repeatedly of the experts that I'm familiar with, how could this happen? Was Qatar fooled? Were they asleep at the switch? How did this occur? And ultimately, I was told by people who had worked in the region. These are Americans who've been intimately involved in air and missile defense technology in the Emirates and the Persian Gulf. And what they told me was that Qatar ultimately was aware that the Israelis were coming, because the quality of their air defenses and their radars and missiles are such that the Israelis could not have done that unless there was some sort of agreement in advance that they would not be attacked. In other words, Qatar was in on it. Now, of course, you have, as soon as the event is over, you have all the representatives of Qatar making all the usual speeches condemning, this event and condemning the Israelis and saying this is terrible and awful and on and on and on. But Qatar hasn't changed any of its policies. And as a result, I think probably the Israelis had a behind-the-scenes deal, could well have been brokered by us. The other thing is that initially we tried to act as though we knew nothing about it. Then subsequently, Israeli members of the government admitted, no, the U.S. was informed. Of course we were informed.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
And now we know that Royal Air Force tankers provided the refueling capacity in the air. So the British were involved. I think it's one. Now, these are the technical dimensions of the whole business. As far as the attack is concerned, I think everyone that might want to negotiate with Israel or us is probably going to have second thoughts in the future, because there's no evidence of any good faith whatsoever. Look what happened when the attack on Iran had begun. We were supposedly holding talks with the Iranians, and we acted as though, well, we knew nothing about this. Well, I don't think that's true either. So why would people in the future regard us as a credible negotiating partner? I don't think they will.
Why the discrepancy? That's what perplexes me. Why the discrepancy between what we're seeing in the Middle East, with the points you've made, that what Iran was, even Hezbollah was lured into that meeting where they killed Nasrallah and other leaders. So all these strikes were surprise strikes, very successful decapitation strikes. I think you might challenge how successful they are, but they include some sort of bad faith. One could make that argument. But it's opposite happening in Russia. Trump is opening the red carpet for Putin, meeting him in Alaska, and genuinely seeking peace. Why do you think that we are seeing those two different attempts, unless you disagree with what I just said?
Well, if he were genuinely seeking peace, we would have begun serious talks, and we would be well on our way to some sort of agreement. So I don't think that was ever serious at all. First, you got to understand something. This meeting was something we sought. Witkoff was suddenly put on a plane, shipped to Moscow. Please, please, please have a meeting with us. And the Russians said, okay, because they didn't want to be in the position of rejecting a meeting. But historically, meetings between heads of state are preceded by multiple meetings where the foundations for some sort of agreement are created. And the people that come into the final meeting come in with the final agreement in some form. They may hammer out minor details. But my point is that when you go into these kinds of meetings, you have studied the problem for a long time. You have studied your opponent's proposals, and you have your own proposals. And then you go back and forth until you work out an agreement. None of that happened. So it was unserious. And that's effectively what Vladimir Putin said. He said, it's very good to meet. We're glad we did that. These meetings are always helpful. However, nothing emerged from it. And there was still a failure to listen carefully or pay real attention to what the Russians had proposed. This goes all the way back to December of 2021, when they put together complete proposals for a new security architecture in Europe, a set of proposals that they asked us to examine. We never examined them. We refused to examine them. We hadn't examined anything in detail before that meeting. And I think President Trump wanted to do 3 or 4 things. First, he wanted good optics. This is the reality TV star. This is someone who understands the impact of images. He knows how to manipulate public opinion through images. So he sets this up at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, and he parks on either side of the red carpet all of these advanced combat aircraft, F-22s, F-35s, whatever they were. And then as he's greeting warmly Mr. Putin, across the sky flies a B-2 bomber with escorts. And Trump is conveying the impression that we are an all-powerful superpower and that he's now deigning to meet with the president of Russia in order to seek peace. They go into a meeting. It's over in 2 hours. Why? Why did it end so quickly? Because Trump and his team had nothing to propose. Trump thought that he was going to overawe Vladimir Putin with his image, with his glittering personality, the force and power of Trump and the Trump myth, and that something good would come out of this, that he could get the Russians to back down from their positions and agree to a ceasefire. There was no chance of that. Absolutely not.
What's the disagreement? Because I think both leaders do want peace, but they just want it on different terms.
Well, the terms
everyone's debating what those terms are, but
listen, the terms on the Russian side are very clear. They have not been altered in any way. We have never addressed those terms. We keep saying we have to have a ceasefire. We have to have a ceasefire. Everybody's lost sight of the fact that you had a ceasefire in 1918 after you had a long period of negotiations and an agreement was reached. Then you got a ceasefire. You don't get a ceasefire in the middle of a war when there is no agreement to stop fighting. There's only an agreement for a temporary ceasefire. And the Russians have repeated over and over and over again, and in my judgment, justifiably, we want an agreement. We get an agreement, and we have guarantees that people will follow through on what they say, then we'll have a ceasefire. And they have stipulated what's important to them. We have not addressed any of those points. We keep arguing for a ceasefire. When we stop shooting, then we can talk. No, it doesn't work that way. It never has.
There's 2 other, it's kind of mixed messages over the last few days. You've got the improvements between U.S.-Belarusian relations. Lukashenko, I think, released some political prisoners. And Trump said, after calling Lukashenko a highly respected leader, he said that they're looking at, I think, reopening the embassy or something along those lines. Yes, reopening the embassy. But on the other hand, you've got the Trump statement that his patience in an interview, I think yesterday, said his patience is running out with President Putin. What do you make of these 2 statements? The way I see it is that Trump seeks peace. He wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to be the peace president. But Putin has, as you said, and I think we disagree on how much upper hand he has, but we both agree he has the upper hand on the ground. So Putin has the upper hand, and Putin has a stronger negotiating position and that's making it difficult for Trump to find some sort of middle ground. Do you agree with that analysis, or you have a different take on these two mixed messages? The running out of patience, peace with Belarus.
Depends on which audience he wants to address at any given point in time. He has a tendency to be somewhat schizophrenic when he approaches foreign policy. I mean, he'll say one thing one day and another 2 days later, and people are trying to figure out which one is true. Which direction do I go in? I think we're past the point of dealing with intentions. I have personally never doubted President Trump's intention to seek a peaceful solution in Ukraine. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But intentions don't count for much. That's the first thing. Actions are everything. This man, Zelensky, has treated Trump, in my judgment, with contempt and taken positions that President Trump on his best day could never support. And President Trump, for reasons that are unclear to me, has tolerated it. I don't know why. If you're really interested in peace, and great powers normally are interested in peace because they understand what a great power war means, usually tell a small country under a small leader like Mr. Zelensky to shut up, sit in the corner, and we'll tell you what the outcome looks like. That's what you do if you want peace. President Trump has the power as the president of the United States and the leader of NATO to do exactly that. Or, Mario, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he doesn't have that power. Maybe he doesn't have sufficient backing at home. Maybe he no longer controls NATO. NATO itself is no longer controlled. The globalist leaders in the West are now facing internal revolution at home. They can't possibly back down from the positions they've taken on Russia without complete loss of credibility. If you're Macron, or if you're Merz, or Donald Tusk in Poland, how do you turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, we really didn't tell you the truth. Russia doesn't want to conquer Europe. Russia isn't interested in going to war. We've been pushing this agenda for reasons that have nothing to do with our national interests, but we want to stay in power, because that's effectively what they're saying. Starmer's in the same boat. It's ridiculous. President Trump doesn't have to go that far. He's remote from it. But let's go back to something else that you brought up, which is very, very important. You said, well, Putin has the upper hand, at least on the ground. That's what counts, Mario. The rest of it is crap. Are we willing to fight in eastern Ukraine? Quick, tell me. Answer.
No, not with boots on the ground.
No.
Not with boots on the ground, that's for sure.
We're not going to put any troops on the ground. Absolutely not. We may have 100,000 troops sitting around in Poland and Lithuania and Romania. What they're doing is I have no idea. They don't have any military mission. They're not ready to fight anybody. They're the same old force that we've had for 30 years. They're not equipped for a new and different warfare. Now, we do have headquarters on the ground in Europe, one in Germany, from which we've been directing operations in Ukraine, because the war in Ukraine is really our war. We've just expended a lot of Ukrainian life in the process. But the point is, we're not going to fight on the ground. Are the Europeans going to fight on the ground? We've just had the president of Poland, Nawrocki, the new president, say, absolutely not. No Polish troops will go into Ukraine. Okay. So what are we going to do?
Economic pressure? Let's see, like the last card that the West has, obviously there's no support for boots on the ground. I think we all agree, but the last card is economic pressure. Now, it's debatable how well it's working. It doesn't seem to be working too well. Now it's trying through India, but with India leaning more towards China and Russia, it doesn't look like this is working either.
Well, let's this is a very important point, and you're making the correct assessment. It doesn't work. What we're seeing happen in the world is a split between the Western financial system that has dominated the world, certainly since 1945. We did have this massive change undertaken under Nixon in 73 with abandoning the gold standard. But the bottom line is that we in the West, we're talking about basically London and New York City and Washington, we've controlled transactions, trade, financial operations around the world nonstop. That's ending. And so the world is splitting, and you have on this side now something we call BRICS. And BRICS, miraculously, in the last few years, has developed parallel institutions. They have the SWIFT equivalent that is actually faster, more convenient, and operates better than our own SWIFT system. In the meantime, We are losing ground because major powers in Asia, major powers in South America, major powers in Africa are moving away from us and moving towards BRICS. So we're looking at a split in the global financial system. If you take China, take India and Russia, now start adding Brazil and South Africa, and increasingly, I would argue, much of Africa, period. I think we're going to see the Saudis and others in the Middle East eventually migrate in the same direction. They're migrating away from us, and they're migrating in the direction of BRICS. This is an event that is almost, well, it probably is as important as 1492. And people say, what do you mean 1492? Well, 1492 was the beginning of the end of Ottoman power in the Middle East because trade shifted. Gold, silver, wealth, power shifted away from the Middle East. And the Middle East was no longer capable of transporting and doing business between China, India, and the West. And the West now had a huge source of gold and income that came out of the New World. This promoted a complete split, and we saw the Western world take off. It took off for many reasons, but now in the Western world, with all of that wealth, there was a huge demand for science and technology and commerce. We're seeing something similar to that happen today. Only it's not because we discovered a new civilization or a new country halfway around the world. It's not because we got to Mars and landed there and found something new. It's because China, India, most of Asia, most of Africa, and increasing large portions of South America are all moving away from us into a new gold-backed system of currencies. And we and our West Europeans, maybe some East Europeans, but certainly West Europeans, are standing around wondering, where are we headed? And where is Australia going to go? Or New Zealand? Where do they migrate? Are they going to sit with us, or are they going to migrate in a different direction? I think all of these things have to be viewed against the backdrop of everything we're discussing. This isn't just about what's going to happen in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is effectively over. The Russians have won. They will determine what happens in Eastern and Western Ukraine. That's coming. And eventually the people that live on that border, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, and Moldova, they're all going to have to do business with the Russians, whether they like it or not. Hungary knows that. Slovakia knows that. Romania knows that, but they were cheated out of their electoral victory by a globalist. But the globalists are on the run. They're in retreat. They're going to lose power. It'll be interesting to see what happens after that. Now, I can't predict what happens with us, those who are not in BRICS and part of it. I don't know what we'll do. I don't think we can go to a gold-backed system. I'm not sure that we have enough gold to do it. Maybe we're talking about a digitization, digital currency. I have no idea. But what I'm saying is this split is a function of everything happening, not only in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East. And if you notice something else, Mr. Trump has made it increasingly clear that he is largely disinterested in going to war with China. That's very important. Remember we had this pivot to China. We have to pivot to China.
Yeah.
It never happened.
And what was Biden's statement? Would you defend Taiwan if China invests in Taiwan? The answer was direct yes in that interview.
No.
That was under Biden administration, but it seems now it's less hawkish towards China.
Yeah. Oh, I think Donald Trump wants nothing to do with a war against China. If anything, I think right now in the White House, he and his little band of advisors are trying to figure out how do we get out from underneath this terrible tariff war. You know, this tariff war has done nothing but destruction.
No, the reason I found that hard to believe is Zelensky seemed pretty optimistic after his meetings with Trump. He put out a post, it was today or yesterday. He said it was a good conversation about the outcomes of this visit to the US, my talks with President Trump, and the important shift in his signals regarding support for Ukraine. And then he said, we discussed many things with the president, foremost political support for Ukraine, strategic support for Ukraine, and future considerations, but also the very important tactical support needed right now to endure. Is it possible that because you initially said that he's become, Joe Biden 2.0, which is increasing support and aid to Ukraine. But then you later on said something that, again, Alex said yesterday, is that he's absolving himself from the fight. He's saying, look, this is Europe's problem. I'm out. and this truth post is more of a hedge if things go sideways and Russia continues advancing. Which one is it? Do you think, or could it be both? Could it be increasing support but also hedging himself?
Yes, I think he's doing both. And this is not unusual for politicians. Politicians want to say everything that's possible to endear themselves to everybody in the room. I don't think Trump is very different. That's why I say this is an abdication of leadership on his part. Instead of recognizing the facts on the ground and saying, we've got to sit down and put an end to this, otherwise the Ukrainian state won't survive, he simply walked away and said, here, I'll give you all the stuff that you want. So I think it's both. The unfortunate part is it's not an answer. It does nothing for Ukraine. Now, if you're Zelensky, who already has piled up somewhere between 1.2 and 1.7 billion in cash in various bank accounts from the money that you've been able to steal from everything that's gone into Ukraine, and you're sitting on top of an organized crime state, half the material that we've sent over there ends up being sold on the black market. That's why we watch drug cartel members walking around with Javelin missiles. He's happy. It keeps him in power, so he thinks. The question that's really important now is that what is President Putin going to do? You know, he doesn't expect a great deal to change in terms of the military capability that will show up in Western Ukraine. Does he continue to wait until these European states leaders are overthrown? In other words, removed from office, and nationalists who actually care about their countries come to power? I mean, that's what he's been doing, in my judgment. Or does he say, listen, let's end this thing. Let's put pedal to the metal. Let's move to the river, take Odessa, and prepare to cross and deal with Kiev. Is that where he's going to go? I don't know. But he has the upper hand militarily on the ground. No question about it.
If you were advising Europe right now, you've seen that post from Trump, potentially increasing support to Ukraine, but also absolving himself from if things go wrong. What would you make of this shift in strategy, and how should they go about ending this war?
Well, I would do what Orban suggests. I would say, particularly if I were Merz in Berlin, since he has the most to lose at this stage if this nonsense continues. I mean, if he delivers Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians, substantial parts of Germany could end up being destroyed because the Russians aren't going to put up with that. They're not going to tolerate it. That would be analogous to us tolerating the delivery of dangerous deep strike missile systems to Mexico to be fired into the United States that happen to come from China. At some point, you turn around to China and say that's unacceptable. So protect your coast. We're going to level a couple of places. That's really where we are right now. A lot of Russians are very angry over this. So I guess the answer is Orban is correct. If I were a European, I would get together with my coalition of the willing, if you will, and I would say, we got to put together a proposal for Moscow. Let's send them a proposal. Let's study what they've already said. They're talking about a new security architecture. Okay, let's look at it. Then we'll put our proposal together and we'll go to Moscow and meet with President Putin. And I think that would work. They could do it. That's Zelensky's nightmare, that could happen, because that's when he is absolutely finished. That's when he gets into his private jet, flies to Italy, or flies over to Florida and settles down into his $15 million estate south of Naples.
There's another report that came out that kind of contradicts the U.S. increasing support for Ukraine. So Pentagon officials told European leaders in August that the U.S. plans to cut back military aid to Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They warned Europe needs to rely less on America, since Trump wants the U.S. military focus more on homeland defense. So we've got that report, but we've also got the report of Trump telling, I think it was Lithuania's leader, to shoot down, or Estonia's leader, to shoot down any Russian jets, giving them authority to shoot them down. But later on, when asked whether the U.S. would get involved if that happens, he said depends on a case-by-case basis. Rubio walked down those comments. What do you make of all this?
The last time that I spoke privately and personally with President Trump, when I was in the administration in November, December of 2020, and before that in April of 2020, when I first met him, he made it very clear to me that he wanted to dramatically reduce European dependence upon the United States. There's no question about it militarily. and we exchanged views. And the idea was, he said, frankly, Doug, what do you think happens? Are the Germans ever going to increase their investment in defense? And I said, yes, sir, when we leave. And he knows that. Nothing fundamentally is going to change in Europe until we get out of it. And that's not just in military terms, that's in political terms as well. Our presence, our influence in Europe right now is a crutch that enables the Europeans to avoid doing the things that they need to do. And one of the things they absolutely need to do is get along with Russia. Stop pretending the Russians are going to invade. They're not interested in invading. It's over.
It could. We've seen China fill that void as the US is pulling out, especially with the alienation of the Gulf countries. China's increasingly filling that void in the Gulf nations. Could we see China fill that void that the US is leaving in Europe and that alienation of European allies? I know it's a stretch.
You mean militarily?
Militarily, yeah.
No. I think what the Chinese are doing, which is extremely important right now, is that they have concluded accurately that the dollar is failing. If the dollar is failing, what do you do with all the treasury bonds that you purchase from the United States? You begin to dump them. They've been reducing their vulnerability to the dollar's weakness for months, from over 1 billion down to about 750 million. And I think it's continuing to drop. What they're doing instead is that they're opening gold vaults, one in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, one that will be in Hong Kong. These are beyond the Shanghai Gold Exchange. These vaults are going to contain great quantities of gold for gold-backed transactions. Now, what are these gold-backed transactions designed to replace? They're going to replace the petrodollar. This is so when China ships whatever goods it does, military or otherwise, to Saudi Arabia can pay in gold. If the Chinese buy oil and gas from Saudi Arabia, the Chinese can pay for it in gold. These are literally warehouses with gold in them. And you move the gold from point A to point B as it changes hands. Now, if you don't want to do that, you can still trade in yuan. And right now, Saudi Arabia and China are trading in yuan because the yuan is de facto backed by gold. So the lesson is fiat currency can be diluted. Fiat currency, the United States dollar, is being debased by our country. We are debasing it because we don't want to restructure the debt. In other words, we don't want to go through default. So we're debasing the currency. This isn't going to work because the rest of the world now treats the dollar as poison. The problem for the Chinese and BRICS in general is that their banking system is not as fully developed and sophisticated as ours. But they are conducting transactions across international lines in their respective currencies. That's going to grow more and more in the near future. Fewer and fewer people are going to use the dollar. That handwriting is on the wall.
Yeah, I think you've put that as well in your post that for the first time ever. And just before I continue, quick correction. I think what you meant earlier is from $1 trillion to $750 billion in terms of U.S. treasuries by China, not a billion. But you did talk about how for the first time ever, as a reserve asset, gold has overtaken the U.S. dollar. I think this is a silent threat to the U.S. that no one's talking about as the U.S. continues to overextend itself. But what looks worse, as we slowly wrap up, what looks worse than what's happening in Europe for the US is what's happening in the Middle East. We've seen that defense pact between Saudi and Pakistan. Saudi's hedging their bets. We've seen China in talks with those Gulf nations to supply even more weaponry. How far do you think Israel will go with American support? And do you think they will continue alienating those Gulf nations, or do you think the US will be able to perform some damage control after the strikes on Qatar?
I think the damage control is going to be tough. I think this Abraham Accords is dead on arrival. So I think we're in a new era. So I think what the Chinese are doing is enabling the coalescence of Muslim nations into an alliance that can respond to Israel. I think you're going to see Chinese strike weapons, missiles, radars, and so forth, the most recent technologically advanced available, show up in places like Egypt. Not just in Egypt, probably in the Emirates, I fully expect something similar will happen with the Turks. All of these nations have had it with us. You know, the problem we face, and we don't understand this, I know that President Trump doesn't. What's happening between Israel and the rest of the Muslim world is as follows. There will be no two-state solution anymore. That may have been possible at one point, but it will not exist in the future. So you get one of two outcomes. Either there is no Palestinian state, there is only an Israeli state, or you get a Palestinian state and there will be no more Israeli state. In other words, this is a fight to the finish. This is a battle of annihilation now, and the region is arming itself for that outcome. China is enabling that in its own way. Now, the Russians are also interested in this because they are heavily invested in Iran and its role in BRICS and its role in commerce and military cooperation and everything else with Russia. So Russia is also involved, but China has taken the lead on this thing from an economic and a military assistance standpoint. We are probably not noticing, or we're not accepting this reality. Because if we did, we'd turn to the Israelis and say, it's time to stop. But since the Israelis control us and we don't control them, and Mr. Netanyahu controls Trump, Trump doesn't control Mr. Netanyahu, that's very unlikely to happen. So what I see instead is a resumption of the war between Netanyahu, Israel, and Iran. And that will probably spread across the region. This time around, it will not simply be Iran.
So what now then? So we've got this meeting canceled. Everyone's looking forward to it. The war continues. Things are not looking on the ground. People continue dying on a daily basis. Both parties are on two separate pages. Zelensky wants to freeze the battlefront, freeze the current lines, stop the fighting, immediate ceasefire. Putin prefers to either continue or gain Donbass, at least gain the Donbass. How would a middle ground look like for this to end? And what would you do if you were Trump?
Well, let's first of all ask the question, the first question that you asked, what can be done about this? And the short answer is that we can do nothing. We are not the military hegemon. In other words, we are not so vastly superior in our military power that we can dominate Eastern Europe and Russia. It can't be done. That was my point earlier. Russia is a continental power, a land power. We are primarily a maritime and naval power. That's very important to understand. We don't have the staying power in the Eastern Hemisphere. It would be as if the Russians were heavily engaged in Mexico, building up forces there to attack us. That would be insane because we would be the dominant force that they could not possibly resist. So in truth, what can we do? The only thing we can do is essentially what I think President Trump set out to do, which is tell Zelensky to shut up and color. And that's what he has to do. You know, you don't let a small power that is already in the middle of a hopelessly lost war that has cost 1.7 to 1.8 million Ukrainians in uniform, done irreparable damage to generations of Ukrainians. There are many people that don't think the Ukrainian nation will survive this. Now, that's the truth. And what President Trump has said, it's time to stop. We need to get the best possible outcome that we can get. Recognize what we cannot demand. Recognize what we think we can get. There was no willingness on Zelensky's side to do that. So President Trump, I think, would like to wash his hands of the whole thing. I told him that I thought that was the best thing for him to do from the very beginning. Listen, I didn't start this. I don't support it. We're leaving. We're out. And the Europeans are full of nonsense. These people have nothing to offer. They don't have armies to send. And if they tried to, they'd all be obliterated.
Yeah, there's been reports earlier that the US is moving their military, a lot of their military installations away from Eastern Europe, at least military support from Eastern Europe. There were unconfirmed reports which showed, and then also there was the post in Truth Social by Trump where he said, Zelensky could regain all their territory back, maybe go further. Good luck to them with the support of support of NATO and support of the EU. So it looked like that he was washing his hands early on. Is that an indication that if Zelensky does not accept a deal now, there is a possibility that Trump does walk away? Because we also know he wants to achieve peace. He wants that achievement like he had in the Middle East.
Well, what does he have in the Middle East?
at least a ceasefire for now. I know there's a lot of
I don't
holes
think
in
so.
it.
I don't think so. I think the Israelis are doing exactly what the hell they want to do. I don't think they give a damn about any of the alleged agreements that were made. And I didn't see Hamas or Netanyahu show up in Sharm el Sheikh. So I think that's a facade, if it's not just an illusion. That's a personal observation, take it or leave it. I just don't see that as being very meaningful. I don't think that he should sign up for another facade. All you do is damage your credibility. Our credibility is pretty low right now. Very few people in the world believe anything we say. So I think I think President Trump would like to disengage, which is the polite term. And the best way to disengage is to announce to your allies that you're on your own because we're not going to participate in this war with Russia. In other words, if you want to engage Russia directly in an offensive war, remember, we're not talking about a defensive war. We're talking about an offensive war. We're not with you. And that's completely legitimate. At the same time, Ukraine has lost.
But how much will they lose? If the US is not supporting Ukraine anymore, then Putin has an incentive to go beyond the Donbass. At least now there's some sort of deterrence with American support.
Yeah, but you had that map up there. And the only thing that is not currently in Russian hands on that map really is Odessa. That whole banana belt that you highlighted on that thing is the historic Novorossiya, New Russia, and has been Russified. The people that live there are overwhelmingly Russians. Odessa has always been a Russian city, was never part of Ukraine. Everybody says, well, who cares? Back in 1950, Khrushchev gave it to his party buddies after a drunken evening on the town. So now it is. And that's not true. You can say that, but it isn't. But if you look at the green areas to the top, and then you look at the stretch, the green area at the bottom, I'm talking about, there. That area should reach over to Odessa. And I imagine the Russians will take Odessa. Now, I would be more concerned about that if I were Zelensky, because that turns your remaining Ukraine into a landlocked country. If I were in his position, I would not want that to happen. But what is to stop him from getting there? Nothing. He can get there whenever he wants to go. Does he want to go to Kiev? Not really, although he does, revere Kiev as the cradle of Orthodox Christianity as a Russian, but he doesn't really want to fight for it. Does he want to go any further west? Not very much, because the further west you go, the more real Ukrainians you run into. These are not people that are Russified. These are not people of Russian culture and Russian language. He doesn't want to rule them. The problem for the Russians is they don't want Ukraine to be a platform for attack against Russia in the future. And that's been Lavrov's mantra repeatedly. Whatever happens in Ukraine, we don't want to refight this war. We don't want to go back down this road again. We want a new security architecture for Europe. And there's no willingness whatsoever on President Trump's part to discuss that. President Trump has always been very short-fused. Let's get a deal. What's the deal? Well, let's get a ceasefire. That's a deal. What good is a ceasefire if the ceasefire doesn't produce lasting peace? If the ceasefire produces more injustice to both parties? No one wants that. The Russians don't want it. We just want, hey, let's have a deal and we can all go home happy. And I can go back and say, see, I got a deal. And that's what Trump has done in the Middle East. Forget it. That deal isn't real. That's the problem. The war is not over in the Middle East. So the point is, why do we want this in Eastern Europe? We want an end to it, we would think, but we don't care.